Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through two of England's most legendary monarchs, Henry II and his famous son, Richard the Lionheart, whose reigns shaped the very foundations of medieval England and beyond. We'll softly explore the remarkable transformation from the chaos of civil war to the birth of the mighty Angevin Empire. From Henry II's revolutionary legal reforms and his tragic conflict with Thomas Becket to Richard's legendary adventures in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, while witnessing how father and son, despite their differences, created a dynasty that would echo through the centuries. This complete journey will take us from the political anarchy of the 1130s through to the romantic age of chivalry and crusading, discovering how these two extraordinary kings, one a brilliant administrator, the other a legendary warrior, together built and defended an empire stretching from Ireland to the Pyrenees. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which of these two remarkable kings captures your imagination more, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 12th century of royal courts, distant crusades, and the eternal struggle between crown and cross lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Henry, later known as King Henry II of England, entered this world on the 5th day of March in the year 1133 at Le Mans in the Duchy of Normandy in northern France. His father, Geoffrey, held the titles of Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine, making him the sovereign of extensive territories in northwestern and central France, particularly those lands lying west of Paris. During this era, France remained divided among numerous powerful principalities, with the French monarch ruling as a relatively decentralized overlord. Geoffrey earned the epithet the Handsome or the Fair for his distinguished appearance. Henry's mother was the formidable Matilda, called Empress Matilda, due to her position as the potential successor to her father's vast dominions. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England and had previously wed the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. Matilda's ancestry would prove crucial for her son's future destiny. Her father, Henry I, the Norman Duke, who had crossed the Channel in 1066 and claimed England for the Normans. As a younger son, Henry had inherited none of his father's territories when William passed away in 1087. But when his elder brother, William Rufus, perished in 1100, Henry seized England's throne. Eventually, his own son and heir, William, was positioned to succeed him. But in 1120, when Henry was already in his early 50s, William died in a maritime disaster known as the White Ship Catastrophe, throwing the succession into complete uncertainty. Matilda, as one of Henry's daughters, represented one possible line of inheritance, though it was widely accepted that women could not ascend to the throne during that period. Despite this obstacle, Henry I concluded, as he aged, that Matilda would indeed provide his successor through her marriage to Geoffrey. Thus, despite various family disputes between the king and his daughter and son-in-law, there existed a strong claim that the 2-year-old Henry should succeed his grandfather when Henry VI died after a brief illness on the 1st of December 1135. However, this succession would not occur, and the virtual usurpation of England's throne by Henry I's nephew, Stephen of Blois, initiated a period of civil warfare that would persist for nearly 2 decades, the almost 20-year period, from Henry I's death in 1135 to Henry II's eventual complete ascension to power in 1154, is frequently called the Anarchy. Stephen of Blois' seizure of authority following Henry I's death, and the competing claims of the infant Henry, championed by his mother Matilda and father Geoffrey, ensured that no stable succession would emerge. While Stephen was the nephew of William the Conqueror, having been born to the Conqueror's daughter Adela, his accession was not accepted without resistance by his English and Welsh subjects. It would cause the initial stages of a crisis between the English monarchy and the English nobility, which would intensify for decades to follow, with rebellions emerging within Wales and border conflicts with Scotland occurring during the 1130s and 1140s. Then, most forcefully, Matilda and Geoffrey began pressing their claim and that of their infant son. In 1139, Matilda led a direct invasion of southern England with several key noble allies, while she and Geoffrey and their supporters were unable to achieve complete victory over Stephen at this time. They did secure important footholds in southern England, and using their bases of support in France, particularly around Anjou, they were able to continue the conflict in such a way that the anarchy would persist for many years to come. Into the 1140s, the anarchy continued. As it did, Henry was maturing, oblivious to the wars being fought across the English Channel in his name. His early years were spent largely in France, as indeed the vast majority of Henry's life would be. This he shared with many of the early Anglo-Norman kings of England, whose power base lay primarily in Normandy and the other French possessions. Later, from the age of 7, he resided at his father's home in Anjou, where he was educated by Peter of Sens, a well-regarded grammarian and scholar of the mid-11th century. But when he was 9 years of age, a more active involvement for the young would-be monarch was decided upon by his parents. He was sent to Bristol, which was one of the principal towns of England in late medieval times, as well as a center of support for Henry's cause in England during the 1140s. This transfer of Henry to England was at once political and also somewhat dangerous, placing him within reach of Stephen's armies in England, but galvanizing Matilda and Geoffrey's supporters, who for a time knew that the child on whose behalf they were fighting was in England itself. Here Henry continued his education for some time, before returning to France in 1144, where he received his later education as he entered his teenage years under William of Conques, a scholastic philosopher who was a leading early figure in the Christian humanist movement. By 1147, Henry was taking a more active involvement in affairs. That year, he led a military expedition himself to England from Normandy, the beginning of a period in which he would press his own claims to the throne of England, and in addition, he was also gaining powerful allies. From the late 1140s, King David I of Scotland was a prominent supporter. Although an attempt to seize the northern capital at York from Stephen's forces failed in 1149, thereafter matters in France distracted from a full prosecution of the war in England. The French king, Louis VII, who had been absent in the Orient for some time as one of the principal leaders of the Second Crusade, now returned to western France and was immediately troubled by the possibility that Henry would unite Normandy, Anjou, and the family's other French possessions, as well as England, all under his rule. Such a king would possess as great a domain as Louis himself, and would actually command greater resources than him. Accordingly, war followed. But a resolution was quickly patched up in 1151, whereby Henry paid homage to Louis as his feudal overlord, and provided the French king with a number of small properties belonging to the Duchy of Normandy, the title to which Henry had officially been granted in 1150. When Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in September 1151, Henry united the disparate French territories of his mother and father under his own rule, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. These extensive properties in the north and northwest of France were soon expanded when Henry married in 1152. His bride was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who at 30 years of age was 11 years Henry's senior. She had also been married previously to none other than King Louis VII of France, as the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, a man who died without a son in 1137. Eleanor had ascended as Duchess of the large Duchy of Aquitaine, which extended across a large part of western France. She had married Louis the same year, but by 1152 the union had only produced 2 daughters, and as female successors were excluded in the succession to the French monarchy, neither could succeed Louis. Having lost interest in their marriage, Louis successfully acquired an annulment in March 1152. Within weeks, the reason for Eleanor's apathy towards Louis was clear to all, as she married the young Duke of Normandy just 12 weeks after her marriage ended. Louis was furious at both this insult to his honor and at the fact that Henry now had a claim through his marriage to a further large territory in western France. The fallout from Henry's marriage to Eleanor led briefly to renewed conflict between the young Duke and King Louis in France. Yet this only lasted for a few months, and by 1153, with an unprecedentedly large power base in northern and western France, Henry was in a position to decisively challenge Stephen in England. By that time, nearly 2 decades after the civil strife between Stephen and Henry's supporters had begun, the English king was in control of large parts of the north, east, and south of England, including London, while Henry's base lay in the west, particularly around the river Severn Valley. He also had a number of prominent allies, including the powerful northern lord, Ranulph of Chester. However, by 1153, when he arrived in England, the war situation was profoundly different to how it had been for so many years. Henry was no longer a child, but was a very powerful French lord in his own right. This, combined with a lack of support from amongst his nobility in England, persuaded the king, after a limited campaign, to agree a treaty with Henry under the terms of the Treaty of Winchester, or the Treaty of Wallingford, as it is sometimes referred to, and which was formally signed in 1154. Stephen would remain as King of England, but upon his death, Henry would succeed him. Finally, after 20 years and limited bloodshed in its final stages, the anarchy had come to an end. Henry did not have to wait long for the terms of the Treaty of Winchester to be implemented. In 1154, Stephen was no longer a young man. Exactly how old he was by this time is not completely clear, but he was, at least in his late 50s and possibly in his early 60s at the time, a relatively old age for the 12th century. Stephen might well have viewed the treaty as a temporary expedient, during which time he could regroup and muster support for his son William's cause to succeed him over Henry. But if this was the case, ill health scuppered his plans. Then, in the late autumn of 1154, he fell ill from a serious stomach ailment while in Kent and died shortly afterwards on the 25th of October. Henry, by a rather fortuitous series of events, had gone from being at war with Stephen in early 1153 to succeeding him as King of England just a year and a half later. It was the culmination of a meteoric ascent which had seen Henry acquire vast territories through succession, marriage, diplomacy, and military action between 1150 and 1154. Henry is generally deemed to have been the first of the English kings known as the Plantagenet, although this term was not used to refer to the English royal family until the 15th century, over 300 years after Henry's accession. The Plantagenet designation distinguishes Henry and his successors from the kings of England who ruled from William the Conqueror in 1066 through to Henry's own accession, and lasts up to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. The term Plantagenet is something of a linguistic construct rather than being a family name in and of itself. It derives from a nickname which Henry's father, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, was given during his lifetime in recognition of a bright yellow flowering plant which he used to wear as a symbol of his house. The name Plantagenet is derived from this, as the Latin for the same common broom plant is Planta genista, which subsequently, through common usage, became the French term plant. Geniston was then further anglicized as Plantagenet. As a result, the dynasty of English kings, which held the throne from Henry's eventual accession in 1154 through to the advent of the Tudors in 1485, is known as the Plantagenets. Upon his succession, Henry became the ruler of what has become known as the Angevin Empire, or the possessions of the Angevin kings of England. This empire would be held by himself and two of his sons. This imperial designation was granted to Henry's dominions as an acknowledgment of both the extent of the territories he ruled, as well as their cosmopolitan nature. By the time he ascended to the throne in 1154, Henry ruled all of England and virtually the entirety of northern and western France, including the Duchy of Normandy, the County of Anjou, from which the Angevin imperial title was derived, the Duchy of Aquitaine by right of his wife, as well as extensive territories in Maine and Gascony in France. The English crown had virtually secured control over Wales as well by this time, a process which had started under William the Conqueror nearly a century earlier. While England's long history of involvement in Scotland ensured that Henry had a certain amount of influence here also, this, combined with a role within Brittany in northwest France through a marriage arrangement in the 1180s, as well as the rapid conquest of much of Ireland in the early 1170s, ensured that by the middle years of his reign, Henry II was the ruler of a vast empire for its time, one which stretched from Dublin to London and south as far as the Pyrenees. Just who was the new king of this vast expanse of territory in Western Europe? To begin with, his name itself was somewhat ambiguous. In the late medieval period, individuals were very often referred to by a place with which they were associated, or a sobriquet. For instance, the first Anglo-Norman king of England had been William of Normandy prior to his conquest of England, and subsequently became known as William the Conqueror. And as we have seen, subsequent generations would come to refer to Henry and the royal family which he created as the Plantagenets. But at the time, and indeed in chronicles and government records for hundreds of years to come, he was more usually referred to by the quite unusual name of Henry Fitzimpress. This was in honor of the fact that Henry's claim to the throne, and that of his successors, descended by right of his being the son of the Empress Matilda. Furthermore, unlike some of his predecessors, we have a clear idea of what Henry Fitz looked like. He had blue-gray eyes and reddish hair, which he kept short. By temperament, the new king was said to be at once gentle and friendly to those within his inner circle, while also being possessed of a fiery and even explosive temper, one which he often employed to get his way when he met with resistance from his advisors and senior nobility. He was also an extremely energetic individual, one who rarely rested in the same place for prolonged periods of time at ease, as many other monarchs of his own day and later would do. Indeed, one of his common traits was his preference for standing at court rather than sitting. Moreover, his leisure time was often spent hunting and hawking. However, Henry also possessed a sense of humor, as at court he procured the services of a flatulist, Roland the Farter, who would perform one jump, one whistle, and one fart for the king, and it is recorded that he was rewarded with the manor house of Hemmingstone in Suffolk for his services, along with 30 acres of land. But, as well as this, Henry was also possessed of an intellect. He was well read, could engage in debate with scholars, and would have traveled across much of Europe without the need for interpreters. Such was the breadth of languages he spoke. Furthermore, chroniclers of the times attest to his loyalty towards those who were equally loyal to him, but that he displayed unwavering resentment against those whom he felt had betrayed him. In time, this latter trait would create enormous difficulties for his rule and tarnish the legacy of what was otherwise a highly successful reign, whilst Henry had finally secured the throne, after years of struggling with Stephen, and brought the political anarchy which had subsumed England to an end. Henry's reign was quickly confronted by a fresh challenge, and it came from his own brother, Geoffrey. In December 1155, Geoffrey initiated a revolt in France, calling for parts of the family's French possessions to be handed over to him. Now that Henry had assumed power in England, specifically the counties of Anjou and Touraine, an extensive family conference in France in February 1156 failed to resolve the conflict. But within months, without any major military action, Henry managed to crush his brother's ambitions, in part by making Geoffrey the new Count of Nantes, and in the end, the challenge proved beneficial to Henry's cementing of his rule. And when Geoffrey himself died in 1158, the time proved opportune, fully cement Henry's control over his French possessions. Now, Henry would have unequivocal control of the growing Angevin Empire, a hegemony which would not be challenged for nearly 20 years. In part, Henry's success came about because of his own boundless energy, combined with a shrewd pragmatism. The young king knew what was achievable and worked to implement it. But his accomplishments in bringing stability to England and France, after so many years of turmoil, must also be attributed to the intelligence with which he selected his advisors. Significant amongst them was his mother, Matilda, who had done so much to champion Henry's cause in his youth, at a time when he barely knew what it was that was being fought over. She worked extensively with the Church and patronized the Cistercian reform movement throughout the 750s and 1160s until her own death in 1167. Other close advisors included Henry's uncle, Reginald of Cornwall, the Earl of Arundel, William Daubeny, and the justiciars, Robert, Earl of Leicester, and Richard de Lucy. Several senior bishops were also brought into the administration, but no figure was as ubiquitous and influential in the young king's government than the man he made Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas Becket, a protege of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Bec. Becket was recommended to Henry in the mid-1150s and quickly became an indispensable part of his regime, increasing Henry's revenues throughout England. What each of these advisors offered was experience in administration which the young Henry otherwise lacked. These years would also see the almost continuous growth of Henry's family, and eventually Henry and Eleanor would have 8 children in total. Surprisingly, in a time of high infant mortality, all but one of the 8 survived infancy, and by their surviving 4 sons and 3 daughters ranged in age from 15 years old to just 3 years old. The elder daughters, Matilda and Eleanor, were married to the Duke of Saxony, named Henry the Lion, and Alfonso, the King of Castile, respectively, while the third daughter was Joanna. The eldest son was Henry's namesake, who was married to Margaret, the daughter of the King of France, Louis VII. Henry Jr.'s younger brothers were Richard, Geoffrey, and John, 2 of whom, even as younger sons of the king, would eventually go on to have extremely consequential lives and careers in their own right. Richard, not least as a king, and the Lionheart, who would battle with Saladin in the sands of the Holy Land on the Third Crusade, and John as a future king of England, whose famous clash with his barons and nobles in the early 13th century would result in the fashioning of the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Henry's relationship with his sons would soon come to dominate the latter half of his reign. Although he was very often distant from his English dominions, Henry II took a decidedly strong interest in the administration of his kingdom and the oversight of the courts there. For instance, he initiated a series of inquests and issued many royal edicts, which led to the development of a more coherent and centralized bureaucracy. For instance, an ordinance of 1170 brought local officials, such as sheriffs and major local landholders, under greater royal scrutiny and made it clear that wide-scale corruption would no longer be tolerated. Even if Henry was absent in France or elsewhere, and other regulations standardized some specific elements of oversight. For instance, the Assize of the Forest Act of 1184 brought the regulation of forests and the taking of wood from the same into a formal and standardized form of royal control. Other extremely important laws in this regard provided new prohibitions around the ability of landlords to simply eject tenants from their lands and around how freeholds could be created and maintained. These new regulations also evolved the system, which allowed 12 knights to adjudicate on disputes at the local level, which eventually would lead to the development of the modern jury system. In terms of taxation, Henry increased the rates payable based on a knight's service from as early as 1166, based on a document known as the Carte Baronum, or the baronial chart. This was the first countrywide listing of dues which were owed to the crown by knights, and was used by Henry's exchequer officials to increase the potential yield from military taxation. Some of these taxes were gradually increased during the course of the 1180s to pay for exchequer increases, which were necessary to support the Crusades to the Holy Land, as the Muslim Lord Saladin was threatening to recapture Jerusalem and the Crusader states there. Ultimately, Henry's administrative reforms are most clearly defined by the uniformity which he lent to the kingdom's courts and taxation. In the early 12th century, A series of competing judicial systems still existed in England, in large part owing to the overlapping Anglo-Saxon, Norman, and Viking traditions in use across the kingdom. But by the end of Henry's reign, a much greater degree of uniformity had been lent to the system of administration. In the end, Henry II's managerial policies were leading to a situation at the local level where a system had been created which one historian has defined as a species of self-government at the king's command, meaning that local courts and administrators could govern themselves as long as they gave ultimate authority to the king. Henry was, perhaps above all else, an innovator as a king of England, in contrast to William the Conqueror and his immediate successors, in that Henry understood how to manifest and display the royal power which he had attained. In an effort to impress his contemporaries, he employed numerous building programs and other measures which in more modern times would be referred to as acts of propaganda. For instance, Henry had a great leper house or lazarus constructed at Caen in France in the early 1160s, whilst there were many other royal building projects underway throughout Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, and England, which commanded the enormous respect of contemporaries. Such was their grandeur. These displays of wealth and power were intended to convey an aura of strength and prosperity, and were designed to indicate that a strong monarchy had returned after the years of anarchy which preceded Henry's full accession, and Henry was well attuned to the statement architecture could make. An enormous keep was built above the cliffs of Dover, which greeted so many visitors to England as they sailed to Kent from northern France. This building program also extended into the ecclesiastical sphere, Henry acting as a patron of a great many impressive church establishments, both in France and in England. All of this served to cement and aggrandize Henry's rule, something which was much needed in the aftermath of the anarchy of Stephen's reign. Having secured his rule during the course of the 1150s and introduced a number of highly effective reforms to consolidate his grip on the Angevin Empire in the years that followed, Henry might have looked forward to a more sanguine, peaceful time in the 1160s, one in which he could enjoy the fruits of his earlier accomplishments. However, it was not to be so. The 1160s were largely defined in Henry II's reign by conflict, and it came from the strangest of places. We have already seen that one of the individuals in whose hands Henry placed great power in the first years of his reign was Thomas Becket, whom he made Lord Chancellor of England. This patronage of Becket reached its height in 1162 when, following the opening of a vacancy in the position, he promoted Becket to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. As Archbishop, Becket was the senior ecclesiastical officer in all of England, and was theoretically answerable only to the Pope in Rome in the management of many church affairs. Henry's reasoning for this promotion was clear. He wanted an individual who would do his bidding as archbishop, yet it would prove to be one of his few bad moves. A year later, in the summer of 1163, at a major conference held at Woodstock, Becket first quarreled with Henry by attacking the king's effort to turn an annual payment, which was paid to sheriffs by the church, into a form of royal revenue. This was an extraordinary clash, vitriolic in its anger, during the course of which Henry turned in fury on the archbishop and stated that, by the eyes of God, it shall be given as revenue and entered in the royal rolls, to which Becket responded, that, by the reverence of the eyes by which you have sworn, my lord king, there shall be given from all my land, or from the property of the church, not a penny. It was just the first step in an increasingly intense rivalry between the king and England's most senior religious figure. This was all very different to what Henry had expected in 1162 when he promoted Becket. Expected a compliant senior cleric who would act in unison with him as king. The conflict would drag on for the remainder of the 1160s and eventually formed one of the most turbulent and controversial aspects of Henry's reign, one which is still widely remembered and written about today, over 800 years later. Soon after the initial clash between the pair at the Council of Woodstock, the king and the archbishop quarreled yet again over the issue of Becket's right to excommunicate tenants-in-chief on the church's vast lands throughout England without first seeking out royal approval. Henry, perceiving Becket's behavior in this respect to be a breach of his royal position, began to pressure the bishops of England to acknowledge his superior authority over such matters compared to that of Becket as primate of the English Church. These clashes culminated in the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, where Henry presided over a synod which sought to reduce clerical independence. Ultimately, it was no surprise when Becket resisted any efforts by Henry to weaken the church's jurisdiction and rights, and Henry responded by stripping Becket of several large estates, which Becket held by right of his previous role as Lord Chancellor of England. A tit-for-tat exchange followed throughout the mid-1160s, with Becket trying, with some considerable success, to interfere in Henry's marriage arrangements for his wider family, an issue which the Archbishop of Canterbury had some significant jurisdiction over, and Henry, for his part, taking over Becket's personal residence at Berkhamsted and using it henceforth as a royal Christmas retreat. Thereafter, as things ratcheted up in the mid-1160s, the struggle between the pair became increasingly personal. Some distance was maintained between the pair following the Constitution of Clarendon and the various scuffles of the mid-1160s. But the ultimate conflict was simply being delayed, largely by Pope Alexander III, who was himself an exile in France, owing to political strife in mainland Europe involving the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and who had advised Becket to keep his distance from Henry. Nor was the king inclined to let the matter go, and so from 1164 onward, he attempted to break Becket's political resistance by imposing a series of highly punitive financial fines on the archbishop, some of which concerned his previous exercising of the office of Lord Chancellor of England, and which culminated in the charging of an obscene bill of £30,000 against Becket, the equivalent of tens of millions of pounds in today's money. Rather than accept such measures, Becket entered into outright opposition to Henry, fleeing to Flanders in the Low Countries, or modern-day Belgium. Now, the pair would not see each other directly again for 5 years, Becket variously spending time in Flanders and at the papal court of Pope Alexander III in exile during the late 1160s. It is difficult to know on whom the majority of the blame for what had already occurred and what subsequently occurred should be placed. Henry was certainly an autocratic monarch, but Becket was also a cleric who thrived on being at the heart of political intrigue. Moreover, the archbishop liked the fact that he was the center of much of Europe's political correspondence, as the King of England fought with his senior ecclesiastical official. Henry, for his part, hated this need for celebrity in Becket, and viewed the archbishop's disloyalty, after having been promoted by him, in a highly unfavorable light. and yet a rapprochement was eventually reached in July of 1170 as the leading monarch of Western Europe, and the Pope intervened to make the King of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury see eye to eye. It was ultimately an ephemeral peace when Becket landed in Kent in the south of England on the 1st of December 1170. After 5 years in exile on the continent, he cannot have expected what would happen. Disputes over land yet again arose, and within days it was clear that Henry desired to be rid of Becket once and for all. 4 knights who were followers of Henry from northern France duly took up the charge. On the afternoon of the 29th of December 1170, they entered Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the archbishop within the church. The clash had residual consequences for Henry. The conflict between the church and the King of England intensified, and Pope Alexander III quickly had Becket canonized in 1173, one of the swiftest acts of bestowing sainthood ever undertaken by the Roman Catholic Church. Yet Henry tried his level best to separate himself from the murder, which he did not orchestrate directly, with a diplomatic drive amongst the monarchs of Western Europe. Ultimately, Henry feared his excommunication by the Pope, whereby he, even as one of Europe's leading monarchs, would be officially excluded from taking the sacraments and receiving the services of the Catholic Church. Although a general rapprochement was worked out between Henry and the Pope in the course of 1172 and 1173, it was a chastening experience. Overall, the clash with Becket must be remembered as one of the least successful and dire aspects of Henry's reign. He had sought to increase his control over the church, particularly its land and wealth, and succeeded in little other than creating a church and state crisis which dragged on for an entire decade. Yet it was a significant moment in English ecclesiastical affairs, one which foreshadowed the more significant rupture which occurred over 3 centuries later during the reign of Henry VIII. While the clash with Becket generally dominated the 1160s and early 1170s for Henry, another major aspect of his reign was playing out during these years, one which would have enduring consequences for England and Britain down to the present day. This involved the island to the west. Ireland had never been conquered by the Romans, and it remained largely aloof from Britain too during the early Middle Ages, although it too had experienced various Viking encroachments from the late 8th century onward. Nevertheless, by the mid-12th century, it was still a land largely made up of competing Irish kingdoms controlling different parts of the country, such as the provinces of Leinster and Connaught. Yet this rivalry between small kingdoms was about to have an enormous bearing on England's involvement with Ireland, as in 1166 the King of Leinster, Dermot Mac Murchada, pressed a claim to the high kingship of Ireland, and when this was successfully resisted by Rory O'Connor, the King of Connaught, Dermot petitioned for outside help from Henry II. Although Henry did not directly offer aid, he did allow some of his subjects, particularly those in Wales, to consider aiding Dermot. This was to be the beginning of much strife in Ireland. In 1169, one of the major Camber-Norman lords of Wales, Richard Fitzgilbert, or Richard de Clare, who was also known as Strongbow, and who had succeeded in 1148 as Earl of Pembroke in Wales, was successfully solicited by Dermot to undertake a military incursion into Ireland to ally with Dermot against his Irish enemies in a bewilderingly quick military campaign between 1169 and 1171, when Strongbow and his allies, beginning with Robert Fitzstephen, first began arriving in Ireland. they succeeded in conquering large swaths of the country. For instance, Waterford was quickly seized by Strongbow upon his first landing in the south of the country in the early autumn of 1170, and he then moved on to capture Dublin itself. As a result, Dermate was able to consolidate his position within Ireland and was soon challenging his rivals in Connaught and the broader west of the country. As the Cambra Normans in the south and east of the country were consolidating their position, one which would not diminish in one form or another for over 700 years. Moreover, Dermate's death in 1171 removed him as the driving force behind Strongbow's invasion and created a situation in which de Clare and his allies could begin to carve out their own principalities and act upon their own initiatives. All of this quickly agitated Henry, who now perceived de Clare as becoming a potential threat as an overmighty subject across the sea in Ireland. Accordingly, he mounted his own expedition to Ireland in the autumn of 1171, as Rory O'Connor was himself attempting to strike back against Strongbow and his allies around Dublin and Waterford. In the months that followed, Henry II succeeded in firstly asserting his control over Strongbow and his other subjects in Ireland, who may have begun to view themselves as lying outside of his jurisdiction in Britain, while also receiving the submission of a very large number of the more powerful regional Irish rulers and kings. Ultimately, this campaign of Henry's between the autumn of 1171 and the late spring of 1172 transformed the nature of the English intervention in Ireland. What was originally a campaign by some opportunistic mercenaries, led by Strongbow, became a concerted political intervention in Ireland by the English crown. Although Henry quickly left Ireland in 1172, 3 years later the Treaty of Windsor was negotiated with the Irish lords, which effectively acknowledged the English crown as the ruler of Leinster, Meath, Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford. As time went by, this rule extended further north to incorporate East Ulster, leaving the English crown in control of over half of Ireland and cementing its role there for centuries to come. While the Irish conquest must be viewed as a huge success for Henry's reign, at least from the Anglo-Norman perspective, if not from that of the Irish, it was soon followed by further turbulence within Henry's wider dominion. This fresh unrest, following quickly upon the near-decade-long controversy surrounding Becket, must have stung Henry even more than the perceived betrayal of the man he had promoted to Lord Chancellor and then Archbishop of Canterbury. It came from within the king's own family. As we have seen, Henry and Eleanor's union had produced many children by the end of the 1160s. It was customary in Western Europe in the 12th century that a ruler who held such extensive territories as Henry did would begin to hand over control of some of these to his sons as they came of age. Henry himself had been granted the Duchy of Normandy by his father while he was still a teenager, now the king's eldest surviving son and namesake, typically called Henry the Young King, having turned 17 in 1172, began to grow restless at his father's failure to devolve some power to him. Despite naming him as his legal heir in 1170, the young Henry was encouraged in this resentment by two sources. One was his father-in-law, Henry II's on-off nemesis, King Louis VII of France, whose daughter Margaret the young Henry had married. The other was, shockingly, his own mother and King Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. This unrest soon turned into outright plotting and then civil war. one which would come to dominate much of the mid-1170s throughout the Angevin Empire. During it, Henry's consummate abilities as a tactician and diplomat were yet again on display. Before he was fully aware of what the young Henry and King Louis were even plotting, a massive alliance had been formed against him, which included the Kingdom of Scotland and the powerful counts of Boulogne, Flanders, Dreux, and Blois in France and the Low Countries. Moreover, to add insult to injury, Eleanor had succeeded in drawing King Henry's other sons, including Richard the Lionheart, who was also of a substantial age like young Henry, into the conspiracy. But despite this array of enemies, King Henry pulled through. The Count of Boulogne was knocked out of the conflict when he was killed by a crossbow bolt in the summer of 1173. While this also effectively removed the Count of Flanders, the Count of Boulogne's brother, from the war. Similarly, the back of the rebellion was broken in Britain when King William I of Scotland was captured at the Battle of Alnwick in Northumberland in July 1174. Henry studiously stayed away from these conflicts and oversaw events from afar, allowing his enemies to damage their own efforts through overt involvement. But surely the most significant moment in the war came when Eleanor was captured as she was traveling to Paris from Poitou, and this, combined with the military defeats of their allies, forced the young Henry and his brothers to concede to their father in 1174. Yet despite the victory of Henry Fitzimpress over his family, many of the familial problems which had brought about the rebellion would remain and continued to fester in the years that followed. Henry never forgave Eleanor, and in 1175 he sought to obtain an annulment of their marriage from the papacy, a move which was protested vigorously against by his sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, and which was, in any event, blocked by Pope Alexander. Nevertheless, it was a clear indication of how precarious the familial situation was in the aftermath of the Civil War of the mid-1170s, and more tangibly, Eleanor was kept effectively under imprisonment by Henry in the years that followed, although his sons were given more leeway. For instance, Richard was given some authority over the Duchy of Aquitaine after 1174, and when Geoffrey married Constance of Brittany and effectively brought that duchy in northwest France into the Angevin sphere of influence in 1181, he too was afforded some control over the region. The young Henry, though, as the leader of the rebellion, was never truly forgiven. When he died prematurely in 1183, in his late 20s, he had not been given control of any major territory, while the period from 1173 through to the young Henry's death, a decade later, had been largely characterized by instability during King Henry's reign, primarily wrought by his own family. The death of the king's heir opened up a period of full-blown political crisis. In part, this was driven by conflict between the sons themselves, each of whom had ambitions to succeed to various parts of the Angevin Empire, and could benefit at the expense of the others. This tension became more extreme with the death of the young Henry in 1183. Now Richard was King Henry's heir, but the question remained as to what territories would pass to him and which would be cut off from the wider Angevin inheritance and granted to Geoffrey and John. And, as ever, the court at Paris looked on, waiting to see what would happen. In 1180, Louis VII was succeeded by his son, Philip II, or Philip Augustus, as he was more commonly known. And it was in this new monarch's best interest to ensure that the Angevin inheritance was split amongst Henry's sons, a move which would weaken them compared to his own power base in central and eastern France. Although in this respect, Philip's aims were hampered in August 1186, when Geoffrey was killed in a jousting accident. There were now just two sons, Richard and John, amongst whom Henry could split his dominion. The result of Geoffrey's death was war between Henry and Philip Augustus, one which would prove the last significant military and political engagement of his life. He hired large numbers of Welsh mercenaries, the very kind who had driven the conquest of Ireland nearly 20 years earlier, to launch a campaign into France in the course of 1187, aided in this instance by the Counts of Flanders and Blois, the enemies of an earlier time. However, now he was joined in his efforts by Richard and John, as the burgeoning Plantagenet dynasty showed some rare unity in the face of this act of overt aggression by the French king. Then a meeting between the two kings in April 1187 failed to reach a compromise, and in the summer, lengthy clashes occurred in central France, around the region of Berry. The resulting engagements were sporadic. For 2 weeks, the opposing armies skirted next to each other around the river Indre, while diplomatic efforts to avoid a full-pitched battle continued. It is a remarkable feature of this time, the degree to which Henry and the French kings attempted to avoid major engagements which would fully resolve their conflict. And then, yet again, before a major conflagration occurred, a temporary peace was patched up. Again, the diplomatic armchairs seemed to have shifted, and Henry's son Richard had apparently intervened with the French king, while the conflict had temporarily abated. The succession issue still remained unresolved, but what would come to be? The last months of Henry's reign in 1188 and 1189 lent a final degree of resolution to it. When the French king Philip yet again invaded Berry, a renewed unity was achieved between Henry and his eldest surviving son, Richard. The fighting brought Henry himself out of England and into France with renewed forces of English and Welsh troops. War erupted all along the frontier between Philip's French dominions and those of the extended Angevin Empire in northern and western France. Large settlements were attacked and largely destroyed. Eventually, a temporary peace was finally patched up in the early winter of 1188, when the ever-powerful and influential counts of Blois and Flanders refused to engage any further in the hostility which pertained in France. Details of a peace were worked out in the weeks that followed, and marriage negotiations between Richard and Philip's royal family were further brought under consideration. These negotiations would still be underway when Henry's life entered its final chapter. A parley occurred between the respective sides in May 1189, but behind the scenes, King Henry was preparing for renewed war with the French. As ever, extensive mercenary units from Wales had been recruited. At the end of the parley, fighting broke out again, but Henry was unable to prosecute the war which followed. His health had been failing for some time, the result of a severe ulcer, diminished physically, and perhaps worn out psychologically, owing to the continuous conflicts with his family members, so many of whom had predeceased him. Henry appeared at a final conference with Philip, with whom Richard was now unequivocally allied, in July 1189. At this meeting, Henry was visibly ill. As a result, he agreed to some conciliatory terms, but was said by a contemporary chronicler, Gerald of Wales, to have defiantly whispered in his eldest surviving son's ear, God grant that I may not die until I have my revenge on you. If he did say this, and the account may be spurious, he would never live to see that wish fulfilled. 2 days later, Henry II, the man who had ruled England for 35 years and had created the Angevin Empire, died at the age of 56. Just hours before he collapsed into a final fever, he learned that his other son John had joined Richard's new rebellion. As a result, many chroniclers and scholars have judged that this final act of betrayal had all proved too much. After years and years of family strife, he was buried in the Abbey of Fontevraud in the county of Anjou, despite the massive difficulties which had arisen in Henry's family relations throughout the 1170s and the 1180s. The succession to his rule would not prove as fraught as had been that which followed the death of Henry I over a century earlier, with its nearly 20 years of anarchy before Henry's own accession in 1154. But the succession in 1189 was complicated nonetheless. Henry's eldest surviving son, Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, as he is more commonly known, had already taken the Crusaders' Jerusalem from the great Arab lord Saladin, who would eventually reconquer the city that year after nearly a century of it being in Christian hands, although he was still in Western Europe when his father died and was duly crowned as King of England at Westminster on the 3rd of September, 1189. 2 months after his father's death. He soon set off for the Holy Land in January 1190. He would not return for several years, and in the interim, his younger brother John assumed a great degree of authority in England. It was the beginning of a period of renewed unrest within England, one which worsened after John succeeded Richard in his own right in 1199, and which culminated in a major baronial revolt in England, the First Barons' War, in 1212. Consequently, the political consensus which Henry II managed to create for much of his reign quickly broke down following his death. Henry II must surely have a place amongst the English kings who are most difficult to decipher. There is little doubting his achievements. Consolidation of power ended a period of nearly 20 years, during which England and its French possessions had been racked by political anarchy, owing to the insecure succession to King Henry I. By way of contrast, Henry II not only secured his ascent to power in his youth, but consolidated his power in such a way as to set England on the path to becoming the most centralized state in late medieval Europe. Beyond this, his marriage to Eleanor and his intervention in Ireland created the so-called Angevin Empire, a political entity which spanned England, Wales, substantial parts of Ireland, and much of France, including Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. All of this is a formidable achievement, but against it must be considered the failings of his rule, notably his inability to control the ambitions of his children and even his own wife. As a result, a state of civil war essentially existed within his kingdom throughout much of the 1170s and 1180s, but perhaps most significantly, his clash with Thomas Becket and the murder of an Archbishop of Canterbury during his reign stands considerably against him. For these reasons, we might say that Henry II was an enigmatic ruler, a king who aspired to greatness and whose reputation was irrevocably tarnished by one or two key failings. What aspects of Henry II's complex reign do you find most intriguing, dear listener? Was he truly one of England's greatest kings, or do the shadows of his conflicts with family and church diminish his remarkable achievements? Let these questions drift through your mind as you settle into peaceful sleep, knowing that tomorrow night we'll continue our gentle journey with his famous son, Richard the Lionheart, and his legendary adventures in the Holy Land. Richard, later known as Richard the Lionheart, entered the world on the 8th day of September in the year 1157 in England, quite possibly at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, one of the royal residences of the Angevin royal family during the 12th century. His father was King Henry II of England, who had been born in 1133. Henry had taken possession of the French territories of the successors of William the Conqueror in the 1140s, including the Duchy of Normandy and the County of Maine in the north of France. But he had contested for years with his cousin, King Stephen I, for possession of England and Wales. Then, 3 years prior to Richard's birth, he finally ascended to these territories when Stephen died, bringing the extended civil war to an end. Richard's mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a formidable woman herself, who had earlier been married to King Louis VII of France before divorcing him and marrying Henry in 1154 as the successor to the Duchy of Aquitaine in western France. She had brought this territory to the marriage, expanding the territory ruled by Henry to cover much of northern and western France. In addition to England and Wales, and the dynasty which Richard was born into is known to posterity as the Plantagenets, after a flower of the order Plantagenista, which Henry II's father used to wear. This family now ruled extended territories on either side of the English Channel, and Richard's life would be spent straddling these two worlds, where the Plantagenets were the royal family of England as well as a major noble family in France. Richard's early life was typical of a family which ruled over a very disparate dominion. King Henry II was the King of England and Lord of Wales, much as the modern-day state of England has included a close connection with Wales for centuries. But the Plantagenet dominions stretched much further still. As the descendant of William the Conqueror, Henry ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in northern France, along with several other territories in northern and western France, such as the County of Maine. Moreover, as we have seen, his marriage to Eleanor had brought the Duchy of Aquitaine into the Plantagenet sphere of control. As a consequence, Henry's dominions were nearly as extensive as those of the French monarchy in France, with the south and east of the country ruled by the French kings from Paris. However, owing to the peculiarities of France's territorial divisions, the kings of England swore allegiance to the French kings as subjects, as dukes of Normandy, even while simultaneously challenging the French crown for political and military predominance throughout France. As well as this, Henry II oversaw the establishment of a new English lordship across the Irish Sea during Richard's youth. Thus, what is known as the Angevin Empire stretched across England, Wales, Ireland, and most of northern and central France. It was this disparate territory which Richard would one day come to rule over during his youth. Many would not have countenanced the idea that young Richard would one day succeed to the kingship, as he had an older brother named Henry after the king himself, while he also had 2 younger brothers, Geoffrey and John, and 3 sisters, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, each of whom would play a consequential part in Richard's life at one time or another. As was typical for the age, the upbringing of Richard and his siblings was the responsibility of his mother. Much of it was entrusted to a nurse named Hodierna, to whom Richard later granted a substantial pension in recognition of her service. And as is typical of the time, little concrete evidence is available for Richard's youth and education, but we know that he would have received a conventional education for a royal son, insofar as it focused on the art of war. Yet there was enough broader reading in there also, that later in life he was also able to read and speak Latin to a very high level, while he also evidently had a keen interest in poems and music. Moreover, several Muslim writers would later attest to him having an interest in Arab culture, although it is unclear if this evinces some previous learning on his part, or was cited by Muslim authors as a way of suggesting the English king was possessed of a considerable cultural tolerance. Richard's adult life was overwhelmingly connected with France rather than England, and this association began early. In June 1172, he was formally made the Duke of Aquitaine when he was just 14 years old. A year later, he was implicated in the first of a series of internal wars within the Plantagenet family, as Eleanor and her sons allied with King Louis VII of France against their father. During this rebellion, Richard was actually knighted by King Louis, and in the summer of 1173 he saw his first significant military action in Normandy. Just weeks later, his father offered Richard full possession of several major castles in France and half of the revenues of Aquitaine, to which he had ascended largely just in name the previous year. This was initially rejected by Richard, however. The nature of the rebellion changed in November 1173, when Eleanor was captured by Henry II. The fighting continued for months thereafter, until Henry the Younger and King Louis elected to make peace with King Henry in 1174, and Richard, who was already showing a surprising degree of independence for a teenager, finally submitted himself in September 1174. Terms were given to the sons, but Eleanor would effectively remain her husband's prisoner for years to come, as a means of offsetting further unrest within the family. Henry II was evidently impressed by his second eldest son's performance during the war. This was a time when familial rivalry, which spilled over into actual rebellion, was not entirely uncommon, and the king would not have viewed his son's revolt as marking a fatal break with them. Accordingly, in the aftermath of the revolt, Henry gave Richard full control of some of the armed forces of the Duchy of Aquitaine, with orders to reduce any rebels who emerged there to peace. This was the first experience of genuine power and rule which Richard would enjoy from 1175 onward through to the late 1180s. Much of this work focused on quelling any independent streaks amongst the nobility of western and central France, notably Aymar, the Viscount of Limoges, and Guillaume, the Count of Angoulême, both of whom were inclined to challenge Plantagenet primacy in the region. In 1176 and 1177, this military campaigning even extended as far south as the borders of Navarre, a small Basque kingdom straddling the Pyrenees in both France and Spain. Consequently, Richard began to develop his reputation for military prowess. At a very young age, as he was still shy of his 20th birthday at this time when he undertook these campaigns, it was this military ability which later earned him the name of Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, a name which was entering into widespread use by the mid to late 1180s. We know a lot about the character of the individual who was emerging at this time from several chronicles composed on him by contemporary or near-contemporary historians and writers. such as Ralph of Coggeshall and Benedict of Peterborough. Richard was evidently exceptionally tall by the standards of the 12th century, standing well over 6 foot high. He was handsome, with reddish blonde hair and a pale complexion. He was known to have a character which favored military prowess, and he cultivated an image of himself as a great warrior, one who patronized troubadours and poets. Though somebody who was also prone to pride and greed, and was sometimes quick to anger, he married later in his life, after lengthy negotiations, to have him wedded to Berengaria, the eldest daughter of Sancho, the 6th of Navarre. Although the union would never produce any children, this latter lack of children, combined with some contemporary allusions to Richard's sexuality, have led 20th century historians to query whether Richard was, in fact, gay, and did not produce any children with Berengaria for this reason. But this is still open to debate, with the sources proving ambiguous, leading other historians to conclude that he might have actually been bisexual. The late 1170s and early 1180s saw Richard's relationship with his father strengthening, despite the rebellion years earlier. In 1176 and 1177, he campaigned as far away as northern Spain in order to shore up the Angevin Empire's southern boundaries in Aquitaine. Simultaneously, his actions could often prove overly heavy-handed, and there are many instances of his crushing of local rebellion, and in particular the pulling down of castles of those whose loyalties were suspected, leading to resentment and unrest. As one poet of the period, Bertrand de Born, noted, he besieges and pursues them, takes their castles, and smashes and burns in every direction, even by the standards of an age which expected warlike behavior of its rulers. There is the inference here that young Richard the Lionheart's tactics were excessive. Resentment at this brutal suppression of any signs of revolt culminated most notably in the outbreak of a major rebellion within Gascony in southwestern France in the late 1170s and early 1180s, and in the Limousin region towards central France. Richard continued to suppress these instances of unrest, though the degree to which he was responsible for causing them through his own heavy-handed rule over Aquitaine is debatable, given the manner in which his actions were often depicted in an overly positive light by later chroniclers. Underlying all of this activity in the late 1170s and into the early 1180s was continuing familial conflict amongst Richard, his brothers, and their father, aggravated by Henry II's ongoing imprisonment of their mother, Eleanor, and much of this increasingly focused on the issue of the succession as Henry II neared his 50th year. What would have been considered the beginnings of old age in the 12th century, whilst Henry was his eldest son and heir designate, according to the principle of primogeniture. The disparate nature of the Angevin Empire and the antagonistic relationship between who would succeed to which parts of Henry's dominions, and perennial tension as a result. Richard, for instance, clearly hoped to secure Aquitaine for himself over his elder brother. This all boiled over in the winter of 1182, when King Henry asked Richard to pay homage to his elder brother, Henry. This required Richard to acknowledge that Henry would have some say over the Duchy of Aquitaine in time to come, whereas Richard was clearly pressing to have the duchy separated from the wider Angevin Empire and made his own fiefdom upon his father's death. When this became clear, Henry sent the third eldest son, Geoffrey, to Richard's territories to prepare a family conference. However, this backfired. witnessed a dramatic shift in the diplomatic arrangements within the Angevin Empire. On the 11th of June that summer, Henry II's eldest surviving son and namesake, sometimes referred to as Henry the Young King, died of dysentery, while yet again in rebellion against his father in central France. Richard was now his father's eldest surviving son and the new heir of the Angevin territories in England, Wales, Ireland, and much of France. On the surface, the reduced number of sons should have made the family rivalries more stable, particularly so when the king's third son, Geoffrey, also died in 1186, in largely unclear circumstances surrounding a jousting tournament. Yet this did not bring an end to the Plantagenet family squabbles. John particularly so, following Geoffrey's death. Henry now wished for John to inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine, while Richard would take the rest of his father's land. Conversely, Richard would not easily agree to his father's wishes in this respect, not least because his long-standing ties to Aquitaine had created a personal attachment to the duchy for him. It was thus, in an effort to force his father's hand in this respect, that Richard allied with the French king Philip II in 1187. It would be the last rebellion between Henry and one of his sons. The rebellion of 1187 proceeded quickly. Philip II had succeeded to the throne of France in 1180 when he was just 15 years of age. Between when they first allied with each other and Richard's own death over a decade later, yet during the late 1180s, culminated in a major military defeat of Henry in the summer of 1189 at a final conference. Henry was visibly ill and is believed to have cursed Richard. He died days later, on the 6th of July, 1189, leaving Richard as his clear successor, and the new king moved quickly to secure his patrimony. He was invested as the Duke of Normandy 2 weeks later, on the 20th of July. Later that summer, he made one of the few, very brief visits he ever made to England and was crowned as. After over 15 years of internal strife, the political landscape of the Angevin Empire seemed to be settling down. Richard had only his brother John as a rival. He might have posed little threat. Richard was preparing to head to a new challenge, one very far away. A call had come from the Crusader states of the Holy Land. The Crusades were an ongoing series of wars which European Christians had been engaged in since the late 11th century, to reclaim the Holy Land around Palestine and Syria, especially Jerusalem, for the Christian powers. For centuries after the rise of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Holy Land had remained in Christian hands, specifically as part of the Byzantine Empire. However, in the 7th century, these territories were quickly overrun and conquered by the Arabs and assimilated into their caliphate, which was soon ruled from Baghdad. Yet, while the loss of the holy places associated with Jesus and his followers was a blow for Christian Europe, it was mitigated by the general tolerance of the Muslim powers, which allowed Christian pilgrims from Europe to visit the Holy Land, relatively unimpeded. But in the course of the 11th century, this equilibrium changed as the Seljuk Turks, an aggressively expansionist people from Central Asia, conquered most of the Middle East, threatening the Byzantine Empire's capital at Constantinople and reducing access for Christians to the Holy Land. In response, the Byzantine imperial government appealed to the Christian powers of Western 1290s. In 1095, Pope Urban I first preached the need for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. This met with a highly enthusiastic response, and tens of thousands took the Crusader cross and headed eastwards, including numerous senior nobles from France, England, and Germany, and by 1099 this First Crusade had resulted in the conquest of the Holy Land and the establishment of several Crusader states, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. These kingdoms and principalities flourished for decades, until a Muslim force reconquered the city of Edessa in 1144, triggering a second crusade between 1147 and 1150. Although King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany went east. On this occasion, the Second Crusade met with little success, and things were calm again for years afterward. But in the 1170s and early 1180s, a new Muslim ruler from Kurdistan succeeded in uniting the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, thus encircling the Crusader kingdom. This warlord's name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is more widely known by his honorific title, Saladin, meaning the goodness of faith. In the summer of 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin, and that autumn Jerusalem was recaptured from the Christians. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem. Richard had already determined to head to the Holy, as news of Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin had trickled into Europe. And in the months that followed, King Philip of France, and indeed King Henry II, prior to his death, had committed to doing the same. These were not untypical acts for leading European monarchs and lords who wished to appear committed to the crusading ideal, but in this particular instance, the Western European monarchs were wholly committed to doing so, and Richard remained committed to undertaking his quest to the Middle East following his accession as king, and so plans were underway to depart throughout the summer and autumn of 1189 and into the winter. The primary goal here was to raise sufficient financing for the initiative, one which would require a considerable fleet to convey troops across the Mediterranean, as well as massive logistical support over several years. A tithe or 10% tax was raised to that end to fund the crusade, known as the Saladin tithe, one which had been begun by Henry II before his death. Simultaneously, the church hierarchy of England and of the various Angevin territories in Wales, Ireland, and France were coerced into providing thousands of pounds of funding towards the Third Crusade, which Richard was now committed to undertaking. In 1190, there were some final preparations to be made in England and France before Richard could depart. The goal here was to put in place individuals in the regions, particularly the various duchies and counties under his control in France, who would prop up Richard's rule during what was sure to be a lengthy absence in the Holy Land. Thus, William Fitzralph, a stalwart of Henry II's rule, and one who had shown considerable support for Richard since his accession, was confirmed as seneschal of the Duchy of Normandy, effectively making him the governor of the large territory of northern France. Payne de Rochefort was appointed as his counterpart as seneschal of Anjou in western France, but most significant was the appointment of William de Longchamp, the Lord Chancellor of England, as the head of the government there during Richard's absence. It was a cutting rebuke of Richard's brother John, who might have hoped to be given a greater role in the governance of his brother's dominions during his absence, and his dissatisfaction at this development would lead to several years of unrest while Richard was away, during which John would seek to continually undermine his brother, principally by attempting to usurp his position as king in England, Normandy, and elsewhere. After months of preparations, the crusade was finally ready to depart by the summer of 1190. At this early stage, Philip II and the two kings left Versailles in central France together. On the 4th of July, 1190, they separated at Lyon, where Philip led his contingents by land over the Alps through Italy, while Richard elected to make for Marseille to sail along the Italian coastline to Sicily from the southern French port. There were extensive delays during these passages, as much of the fleet which had been sent from England and Western, while in Lisbon in Portugal, had particularly slowed proceedings, and so Richard had to hire other ships at Marseille to send much of his forces to the Holy Land ahead of him, and he then conducted a lengthy tour of the Italian coastline to visit locations in the region such as the medical school of Salerno, a trip which evinced Richard's interest in the new learning of the 12th century Renaissance, which was underway in Italy. Finally, he arrived at Messina in Sicily on the 23rd of September, 1190. Here Richard conferred with Philip before the French monarch quickly headed away to the Holy Land. Richard, however, had matters to attend to in Sicily before leaving himself in 1177. Richard's sister Joan had married King William II of Sicily, known as William the Good. William died in November 1189, and the crown was quickly usurped by an illegitimate contender named Tancred. This Tancred then imprisoned Joan, fearing she would become a focus of resistance to his reign. Having arrived in Sicily, Richard quickly secured her release. But there were serious issues to still be resolved concerning Joan's dowry and valuable household plate. Tensions quickly escalated in late September and early October. Richard had ordered his troops to disembark fully from their ships and prepare for battle if necessary, when skirmishes broke out between Richard and Tancred's troops. 2 days later, Richard ordered an attack on the city of Messina, one which quickly proved successful. Peace terms were agreed on the 6th of October, whereby Tancred paid a huge sum of money to Richard, and a formal alliance was agreed between the two. Simultaneously, ships were sent to Spain to bring Richard's long-promised bride, Baron of Navarre, to Sicily, so that the pair could have their long-awaited marriage during the winter of 1190 as they waited to set off for the Holy Land. However, it would not happen here. When Richard finally left his base at Messina, it was several days more before Berengaria finally arrived in Sicily. Richard's Crusader army finally left Italy on the 10th of April 1191, but in the long run, these would prove highly fortuitous. On the third day out from Sicily, a severe storm scattered the fleet, and by the time the ships rendezvoused near the large Greek island of Crete, it was clear that dozens of ships had either been lost or had gone astray in their navigations, and these included one of the royal ships transporting Richard's would-be bride, and a wide-ranging search throughout the eastern Mediterranean was now undertaken to locate it. Eventually, it was discovered to be at anchor in the port of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had long been a possession of the Eastern Byzantine Empire and was governed by Isaac Ducas Komnenos. Komnenos had recently developed delusions of grandeur and had proclaimed himself Emperor of Cyprus, independently of Constantinople. He seized several of the scattered Crusader ships and was considering doing the same with the ship on which Joan and Berengaria were traveling. It would prove a fateful mistake. In early May, Richard arrived in Cyprus. A surprise night attack quickly saw the capital completely overrun. Although the emperor managed to escape, this effectively robbed him of his treasury and military support. And in the weeks that followed, further resistance was mopped up, and Cyprus was brought under the control of the Crusaders. Much of this was achieved by Richard linking up with the leaders of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. One of their primary leaders, Guy de Lusignan, having received word of events in Cyprus, arrived with several contingents of hardened Crusader warriors. Guy de Lusignan was the titular king of Jerusalem, albeit he was a king without a city since the fall of the Holy City to Saladin several years earlier, and he was challenged amongst the nobles of the Crusader states for primacy, notably by Conrad de Montferrat, a claimant to the kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy and Conrad would prove to be the most significant figures in the events which followed in the Holy Land. By the beginning of June, Richard had seized control over the entirety of Cyprus, a rich island nation with notable trade links, and one which would serve as a crucial base for the Crusaders in years to come. In the broader term, Cyprus became an independent Christian kingdom, one which was ruled by the Lusignans for decades to come, and as an independent Christian kingdom down to the late 15th century, making its conquest arguably the most tangible result of Richard's entire crusade. The conquest of Cyprus and the subsequent sojourn there during the summer of 1191 also provided the opportunity for Richard to finally wed Berengaria. The wedding ceremony was held at Limassol on the 12th of May 1191 at the chapel of St. George there. The marriage was designed to potentially unite Navarre and the Duchy of Aquitaine, and thus make it part of the wider Angevin Empire in the long run, but this plan would prove elusive. Richard and Berengaria never had any children. They would remain distant from one another, and it has even been questioned whether the marriage was consummated at all. Nevertheless, the union was celebrated with great fanfare and ceremony throughout Cyprus in the early summer of 1191. Overall, these events would foretell great success for Richard when he finally reached the Holy Land. A great kingdom had already been won for the Crusaders, and the new leader arrived as a successful warrior, newly married. The reality, though, would prove more complex. Richard finally landed near the city of Acre on the 8th of June, 1191. The Crusader states had been besieging Acre since 1189. This siege was the first major counterattack undertaken by the Crusaders since their defeat by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the fall of Jerusalem. The siege was largely driven in its early stages by Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and his primary rival for power amongst the Crusader noble households, Conrad de Montferrat, joined in April by the King of France. Now, with Richard's additional strength added to their efforts, the siege finally proved too much to withstand for the Arab holders. On the 4th of July, the defenders surrendered. Terms were negotiated in the days that followed, which allowed much of the Arab garrison to leave unharmed in return for a substantial bounty and the provision of prisoners as sureties for payment of the same. The end of the siege also led quickly to Philip's decision to return to France. He had nearly died of dysentery outside Acre and was willing to return to Western Europe ahead of Richard, where he could make major efforts to undermine Richard while his rival for power in France remained absent in the Holy Land. Richard was now the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade, but he had yet to meet Saladin openly on the field of battle. This would come soon, as Richard continued his efforts to secure the coastline of Palestine in order to use it to solidify the Crusader position and to use it for a fresh drive to retake Jerusalem. And as he prepared to move towards Jerusalem, a notorious atrocity was committed near Acre in late August. By this time, Saladin had missed the payment of the first installment of the ransom which he had promised for the safe passage of the Arab defenders from Acre weeks earlier, and it was owing to this and the difficulties of transporting large numbers of prisoners inland towards Jerusalem that Richard and his fellow Crusader leaders, such as August, to summarily execute upwards of 3,000 Muslim prisoners before leaving Acre. Richard war as practiced in the late 12th century. This done in the eastern Mediterranean, this latter movement would finally lead to Richard meeting Saladin in the field in the foremost direct engagement between the two leaders of the Third Crusade. The Battle of Arsef was fought on the 7th of September on the route to Jaffa. For days, Saladin, with a force of some 25,000 men, force of roughly 10,000 infantry, and upwards of 1,500 heavy cavalry. The latter were the foremost fighting forces in the Holy Land during the Crusades, but they lacked the maneuverability of Saladin's light cavalry, a fact exacerbated by Richard's unwillingness to move far from his baggage trains and risk losing their water supplies, a decisive factor in the routing of the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when on the 7th of September a full-scale battle was finally entered into. Saladin's troops succeeded in breaking the Crusaders' formation early on. However, a counterattack in the afternoon by Richard roused the Christian lines, opening gaps in their infantry lines for the heavy cavalry to strike forward at the much more vulnerable light cavalry. After 3 charges of this kind, the Arab armies were broken and fled into the adjoining hills and forests. Contemporary accounts of the casualties are wildly exaggerated, but it is estimated that as many as 5,000 or 6,000 of Saladin's men were killed for under 1,000 of Richard's. Arsef was the foremost victory in the field for Richard during the Third Crusade. It opened the route to Jaffa, which the Crusaders reached 3 days later. The walls had been dismantled on Saladin's orders, a decision which effectively surrendered the city to the Christians, but which also ensured that Richard had to spend weeks here until makeshift walls were erected to protect the town for the Crusaders. It was while he was here that Richard began envisaging that the key to securing the Holy Land might lie in striking at Saladin's core dominions in Egypt, and in particular by seizing Cairo. And this was a strategy which was eventually widely accepted as being the best available to the Crusaders many years later during the 13th century. But for now, Richard was overruled by Guy. The early winter was spent seizing and garrisoning several castles on the route inland from Jaffa to Jerusalem. Consequently, by the end of 1191, Richard's crusade had succeeded in conquering Cyprus for the Christian cause, as well as retaking the Palestinian coast from Acre to Jaffa, with the route to Jerusalem being prepared for a strike at the Holy City. The latter campaign, though, would never be undertaken by Richard. Early in 1192, Richard's role in the Crusades began to inexorably wind down. On the 20th of January, 1192, he reached Ascalon, where plans were initiated to begin refortifying the site as a base from which the Muslim powers, caravans traveling across the Holy Land between Syria and Egypt, could be attacked. Yet when disputes broke out here amongst the leading crusaders about how this should be funded, Richard withdrew to Acre. Here, further disputes arose between the Crusader contingents, particularly the merchants representing the major trading powers of Italy, on whose financing and supply much of the Crusader states depended, about how to proceed. Consequently, by the late spring, Richard was increasingly faced with the futility of trying to motivate the disparate leaders and groups involved to act in concord. Moreover, it was while at Acre that he received disconcerting news from Western Europe that fresh unrest had arisen. Back home in his dominions, his brother John was now openly plotting with the French monarchy, and Richard's continued presence in the Holy Land on the Crusades threatened his position as king of the Angevin Empire back home. It was these combined factors which in the spring of 1192 led him to take the decision to return home without capturing the ultimate prize of Jerusalem. There remained a number of things which needed to be resolved in the Holy Land before Richard could leave. First and foremost amongst these was the issue of the leadership of the crusade after the English king left. Would Guy of Lusignan, the acknowledged king of Jerusalem, or Conrad de Montferrat, his would-be challenger, succeed Richard as the head of affairs? In an effort to resolve this, Richard summoned a council where he attempted to establish Conrad as the next head of the Crusader states. In return, Richard sold Cyprus to Guy for a sum of 60,000 bezants. But no sooner had this arrangement been loosely worked out than Conrad was killed by a pair of assassins in late April. It is unclear to this day who had hired these assassins, with everyone from Richard to Saladin being suspected for varying reasons. What is clear is that this cast affairs into further chaos, sealed his decision to leave the Holy Land. On the 2nd of September, a 3-year truce was agreed between Richard and his mortal foe. Richard would surrender Ashkelon, but the entirety of the coast from Jaffa to Acre was back in Christian hands, as well as Cyprus, and Christians were guaranteed free access to Jerusalem. Hence it was that Richard departed the Holy Land on the 9th of October, having failed to achieve ultimate success by capturing Jerusalem. By November 1192, he had reached the Greek island of Corfu, and at this point elected to travel back to Western Europe through Germany rather than westwards through Italy. Richard was conscious in all of this that he was passing through the territory of several princedoms which were opposed to him, notably Leopold of Austria. Leopold was a staunch ally of Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, a would-be leader of any future crusades, and he consequently viewed Richard as his enemy, aware that to pass through Leopold's territory would involve the threat of falling into Henry's hands, accompanied by a relatively small retinue of his most trusted followers, hoping to avoid detection while pretending to be traveling pilgrims on their way back from the Holy Land. But the subterfuge did not work. Their ships crashed on the Istrian coastline, and while heading for Moravia in Austria, they aroused suspicion. As a result, they were finally apprehended near Vienna while passing through Leopold's country in December 1192. Within days, news had been sent to the Emperor Henry that King Richard of England had been apprehended and was being held by Leopold in the castle of Dürnstein, northwest of Vienna. The emperor had more than one reason to have apprehended Richard, for Henry was also loosely allied with King Philip of France. Accordingly, we find the emperor writing to Philip within days to inform the French king of the good news that he had apprehended the English king. Back in England, John also became aware of this and moved to pay homage to Philip in an effort to bolster his claims to succeed his brother. However, the church authorities, which maintained that all crusaders were protected against attacks or seizure when traveling to or from the Holy Land on crusade were less impressed, and extensive pressure was now applied on Leopold and Henry to release Richard. Hence it was that weeks of protracted negotiations to see whether Richard would be released by his German captors and on what terms were entered into. Finally, in late February 1193, terms were concluded in Speyer, after Richard successfully defended himself against trumped-up claims of having abandoned the crusade. Nevertheless, Richard still had to pay a ransom of 100,000 marks and promised to supply the emperor with 50 galleys and the service of 200 knights annually, resources which Henry utilized to launch his own crusade in the years that followed. Further negotiations on these terms ensued. Not everything which had occurred during his absence had disadvantaged his position with regards to John. In 1192, King Philip had stirred up a rebellion in the Duchy of Aquitaine, but this event had demonstrated the strength of some of Richard's alliances. On this occasion, his wife Berengaria's brother, Sancho of Navarre, to the south in the Basque region, intervened during Richard's absence to suppress the revolt. Indeed, Sancho went even further and launched a punitive raid against Toulouse to demonstrate that Richard's French possessions were not open targets while he was in the Holy Land or making his way home and back home in England. Many senior officials who had been loyal to Richard before he departed on the crusade remained so and did their best to thwart John's efforts to undermine his brother. Nevertheless, other developments did not bode well for Richard. In April 1193, King Philip finally inflicted a considerable defeat on Richard's cause when he seized Gisors in Normandy, perhaps because the Castellan, a senior official there, had proved willing to surrender in the belief that John would soon succeed Richard as Duke of Normandy. All of this indicates that there was fresh unrest as Richard arrived back to Western Europe in the early months of 1194. Richard left Germany in February 1194 and reached England on the 13th of March. He passed through the Rhineland on his way, on which journey he renewed some alliances with the princes and lords of Western Germany and the Low Countries around modern-day Belgium, having landed in England. Resistance to his resumption of the crown was strikingly limited, a result, perhaps, of John himself being overseas in the Duchy of Normandy. Richard first visited Edmonds before proceeding to the famous Nottingham Castle to confront the center of John's supposed rebellion. Fighting did occur before the castle surrendered on the 28th of March. Thereafter, Richard resumed the full regalia of his English kingship and presided over several meetings of the government at Winchester before departing for France. In early May, to confront John Hedon in Normandy, he left the government of England to Hubert Walter, who had accompanied Richard on crusade and who had been made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1193. Richard would never return to England, an indication of the degree to which he viewed France as the core component of his dominions, much as his ancestors, as far back as William the Conqueror had, where England had seen little resistance to Richard's return as king and had been quickly stabilized. The Crusader king's return would prove far less seamless in France. John had dug himself into Normandy, where he relied on a close alliance with the French king to cement his position. Thus, by the time that Richard arrived in northern France in the early summer of 1194, John and King Philip had flooded the region with French troops holding a number of key strategic sites across Normandy, as well as other sites, and the French king proved the more loyal and reliable of Richard's opponents. Conversely, no sooner had the English king landed in Normandy than his brother and would-be rival quickly rushed to beg forgiveness from his brother. This Richard agreed to, claiming John had been ill-advised by his counselor. For his part, John would remain loyal to Richard for the remainder of his reign thereafter. Thus, within just days of his arrival, the conflict switched from a pseudo-war between Richard and John to a more traditional war between the King of England and the King of France. And in this, Richard was quickly aided by his familial allies from Navarre, and by mid-June, Tours in central France had been retaken by Richard. The campaign then moved into the Loire River Valley, and after a swift campaign here, he moved south into Aquitaine. By late July, he had captured Tailbourg and Marsillac, the city of Angoulême, Montignac, and Lachaise, thus largely completing Richard's reconquest of his western French territories 3 months after sailing to France from England. Richard's conquest of his French territories, though, would prove more ephemeral than first appeared. In particular, his hold over Normandy was tenuous, and his efforts to fully re-establish his control over the duchy would dominate much of his subsequent reign. In his drive southwards to restore control of Aquitaine in the summer of 1194, Richard had left several castles in the hands of King Philip. Several of these were major strongholds that had been heavily garrisoned in such a way which would require extensive and costly sieges to remove the French. Accordingly, in the late summer of 1194, a truce was agreed whereby these sites would be allowed to remain in the French king's hands until the winter of 1195, but there would be no fighting between Richard and Philip's troops. On the surface, this arrangement provided both monarchs with advantages. It gave Philip time to rethink his strategic stance, now that the chances of replacing Richard with John altogether seemed implausible, while for Richard, this new arrangement would give him a period of 15 months to cement his newly resumed rule and deal effectively with those who had supported John in his attempt to usurp Richard. The truce of 1194 between Richard and the French king proved short. Within weeks of it being agreed, border tensions and skirmishes were breaking out in places throughout France, while by the summer of 1195, full-scale war had effectively recommenced. Richard's approach to this resumed conflict was to concentrate his forces on seizing control of the Auvergne and Berry towards central France. In the border region between Richard's French territories and those of the French monarchy, an approach which quickly bore fruit. By the early autumn of 1195, Philip had indicated that he would relinquish control of any of Richard's territories, which he had seized during the king's absence on crusade, in return for a marriage alliance between Richard's niece Eleanor and Philip's son and heir, Louis. This proposal, though, proved abortive, and as fighting continued to rage, Richard made further conquests, ensuring that Philip had to agree to a treaty in January 1196. Then, under the terms of this Treaty of Louviers, Philip relinquished all of his major gains from Richard's period of absence, except the Vexin in northwestern France and a handful of border castles. This ended the conflict in central France to an extent, but fresh tensions would continue elsewhere in the country. In the years ahead, as 1196 progressed, the war between Richard and Philip changed dramatically. As Philip built up a new alliance of powers to combat Richard's rapid ascendancy on either side of the English Channel. These included several major lords from the Low Countries, notably the Counts of Flanders, Ponthieu, and Boulogne, who were joined in the North Atlantic by the Duchy of Brittany in northwestern France. And this new confederacy was now able to apply extensive pressure on Richard's shipping lines and logistical supplies in the English Channel. In order to offset this threat, Richard needed to divert much of his land forces to an invasion of Brittany in mid-1196. Yet even this setback was only temporary. Eventually, Richard was able to force Count Baldwin of Flanders to change side. Firstly, by launching a massive embargo on trade and the supply of goods, and then by offering a favorable alliance of his own. Thus, Baldwin went from blockading Angevin shipping in the Channel to invading Artois in northeastern France on Richard's behalf, and seizing the considerable French town of Douai. Then, in a remarkable course of events, an alliance of German princes petitioned Richard that they would put forward Richard's nephew, Otto, son of Richard's sister Matilda, and her husband Henry of Bavaria and Saxony, as a potential successor for the office of Holy Roman Emperor. An astonishing diplomatic coup for Richard, while 1197 and 1198 had seen these further successes for Richard. He would not be alive long enough to enjoy their fruits. In the autumn of 1198, Richard elected to complete the final reduction of the Vexin, a small county near Paris itself, from Philip, following the expiration of a new truce with the French king, pressured by the Count of Flanders in the northeast, and by Richard in the west. Philip twice came perilously close to being captured in the campaign which followed, including nearly drowning on one occasion. This virtually completed the conquest of the Vexin, bringing Richard back into possession of all the lands he had previously held before heading to the Holy Land, and placing him in the strongest position any English monarch had held with respect to the French monarchy for decades. This conquest also initiated a major building program in the region, notably the Château Galud, 95 kilometers northwest of Paris, and one of the most impressive medieval castles ever built in northern France. Along with major work to develop the port of Portsmouth, it constitutes one of the only major acts of administration and government which can be associated with Richard's kingship, a reign which was ultimately characterized almost entirely by war, whether in the Holy Land or back in Western Europe. In January 1199, King Richard met with his French counterpart, King Philip, in a meeting brokered by Pope Innocent III. A 5-year truce was now agreed to, one which would see Richard's dominions entering into an unprecedented period of peace and stability. It is entirely peculiar that it was during this period of harmony that Richard would be killed while still in his early 40s. On the 26th of March, 1199, he was shot by a crossbow bolt while campaigning to put down a small regional revolt by Viscount Aymar V of Limoges. In the days that followed, without the benefits of modern medicine, the wound turned gangrenous, and on the 6th of April, he died from the illness. He was subsequently buried at Fontevrault. Richard was succeeded by John N., whom Richard named as his successor during his final illness. The would-be usurper's accession would spell the end of the conflict with Philip, when, in 1200, the Treaty of La Goulette saw John confirmed in his French territories in return for acknowledging Philip as his liege lord in France itself. However, it would prove a short-lived peace, and in the years that followed, the French crown would begin to reconquer several key parts of the Angevin Empire from the English monarchy, the beginning of a long process, which ultimately would take until the 1550s to complete. Overseas, Richard's efforts proved just as transiently successful. Further crusades followed in the years, and indeed decades to come, into the late 13th century. Some of these produced variable levels of success in places other than the Holy Land. For instance, in 1204, a Christian army seized the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and established a Western Roman Catholic Christian state in the Balkans for decades to come. Others attempted to seize Egypt as the strategic key to the Holy Land. Much as Richard had envisaged in 1191, the Sixth Crusade in the late 1220s finally succeeded in capturing Jerusalem. Richard's ultimate goal, which he had been unable to achieve. Nevertheless, this was a fleeting success, and within 15 years, the Holy City was back in Muslim hands. Thereafter, the fate of the Crusader states dwindled, despite efforts by major European monarchs to undertake fresh efforts to reclaim the holy places for the Christian cause. In 1291, 100 years after Richard had landed there in 1191, the Crusader cause was extinguished in the Holy Land. It was due in some considerable way to Richard's efforts, though, that these Christian kingdoms lasted here for as long as they did. Richard the Lionheart is one of England's most acclaimed kings, a somewhat strange development given the shortness of his reign. He ruled for just 10 years, half of which period was spent far overseas in Sicily, Cyprus, the Holy Land, and Germany. Yet it is this period which has also gained him his reputation and made him most famous. For 2 years in the Mediterranean world, Richard led the Crusader effort and rejuvenated it in the wake of years of losses for the Christian states there, as well as successive defeats to Saladin. It is unsurprising that Richard has captured the imagination in this way, not least because he finally offered a counterpoint to the seemingly invincible Muslim warlord. After the stalemate of the Second Crusade in the middle of the 12th century, Richard was depicted as the first major Crusader leader to have made significant conquests and territorial gains in the Holy Land since the late 12th century itself. This appearance of the valorous Crusader warrior, named the Lionheart for his courage, was made all the starker when contrasted with the supposedly scheming specter of his brother John, who back in Western Europe conspired with the French to usurp Richard while his brave brother was away. But while this is the idealized version of Richard, and the basis for so much of his legacy, there is also much to criticize about the Lionheart, criticisms which have dominated studies of the king by historians in recent decades. First and foremost, with the conflicts with his father in the 1170s and 1180s. It continued through his involvement in the Crusades and eased after returning from the Holy Land. While much of the latter conflict can certainly be blamed on others for having usurped some of his territory while he was absent in the East, the reality is that Richard could have negotiated a peace settlement with King Philip long before 1199 if he had been willing to compromise slightly on how many castles in France he wanted to hold. By way of contrast, there is little else of interest within Richard's reign other than his wars. He did build some castles, which again had a military purpose, and left plans when he left England in 1194 for some work to be carried out in his name. But his reign is remarkably bereft of any signature efforts to reform the judiciary, introduce new taxation systems, other than those designed to fund his military endeavor, or offer any form of civil government policy which might have substantially improved the administration of his dominions or the lives of his subjects. But perhaps the most balanced appraisal of Richard the Lionheart is one which takes stock of both extremities of his reign. Richard can certainly be criticized for having done little other than make war throughout his life, but that was, after all, while it is fair to suggest that he could have established peace with France more quickly in the mid-1190s, and moved on from there to working on taxation and issues of noble rights, which plagued John's subsequent reign. It is also only fair to note that Richard was responding to aggression which was committed by others. The Third Crusade was launched in response to Saladin's conquests in the Holy Land, and Richard's wars in France were the result of Philip and John's conspiracies while Richard was away on crusade. Finally, while there is no doubting that Richard was over-lionized by historians and chronicles for centuries after his death, it is also true to say that he was the most successful leader of the Crusades in over 90 years. When he arrived, the Crusader states were facing extinction in the Holy Land, but when he left in 1192, the Christian cause had been rejuvenated and expanded, ensuring its survival for another century. Perhaps in this respect, his most exaggerated legacy is also paradoxically his most genuine. And so we come to the end of our gentle journey through the early Plantagenet king. From Henry II's transformation of England after the chaos of civil war, to Richard's legendary crusading adventures in distant lands, most strongly with you from these tales Henry's legal innovations that still influence us today, or Richard's romantic quests in the Holy Land. Do you see them as visionary leaders or flawed men caught between duty and desire? Let these questions drift peacefully through your mind as you settle into the softest slumber, knowing that the legacy of the Plantagenets, their triumphs and their tragedies, continues to whisper through the corridors of history. Sleep well, sweet dreamer, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle rustling of ancient parchments and the distant sound of church bells echoing across medieval landscapes.